You know that we've hit a point in the emulation cycle of hardware when a new device gives a nostalgic feeling, not to an old gaming system, but to another emulation handheld. The new Anbernic RG35xxH is supposed to be the horizontal counterpart to the 35xx Plus, but there's a whole lot more going on here. From the addition of the analog sticks to even its form factor, I think the 35xxH could be a very interesting emulation handheld that stands out from the rest. As we unbox the 35xxH, when we get to the device itself, I couldn't help but immediately feel a wave of nostalgia. Usually that's because Anbernic devices and these other companies are basing these handhelds off of popular ones like Game Boys or Super Nintendo. But this wasn't nostalgia for a retro console, but nostalgia for my first emulation handheld. The RG35xM is what got me into creating this YouTube channel in the first place. The metal shell on the RG35xM felt refined, and the laminated display was leaps above the other garbage that was available at the time. Sure, there were things that I didn't like about it, but the fact that I was looking at a wonderful quality screen and the ability to emulate hundreds of thousands of games on such an insanely small device was just completely eye-opening to me. Emulation for me had always just been restricted to whatever device you can hack at the time, like my first emulation device, the PSP. The RG35xxH actually feels more like a refined Anbernic RG351. The 351 had a massive Anbernic logo in the front and very large bezels. That giant logo in the chin of the device is gone, and we're left with a nearly bezel-less design. The rest of the device is also very reminiscent of the 351. We've got dual Joy-Con style analog sticks, both with R3 and L3 functionality. We've got a great feeling D-pad and ABXY buttons that are easy to press and don't dip into the shell. We've got the start and select buttons on either side of the screen, above the ABXY and above the D-pad. The top of the device has side-by-side triggers, which I'm really not a fan of, but I'm glad that they've taken cues from their other devices and they have the L2 and R2 slightly raised so it's at least easier to differentiate. The top of the device is also where we'll find the headphone jack, 2 USB-C ports, a mini HDMI out, and a function button. On the left side, we've got a volume rocker. The right side of the device has a power button and a hard reset button. And at the bottom, we've got 2 micro SD card slots. The back of the RG35xxH even has those soft pads like the 351, so it doesn't slide around when you place the device down. The specs of the 35xxH are identical to the 35xx Plus. We have a 3.5-inch IPS 640x480 screen, an H700 quad-core ARM processor, Bluetooth 4.2, Wi-Fi 5, and support for HDMI out. Actually, the only difference spec-wise that I could find between the H and the Plus is that the H is actually 6 grams lighter. The 35xxH comes in 3 different colors: black, transparent purple, and transparent. I've got both the transparent purple and black here, and I've been daily driving the transparent purple because I love that atomic purple color. Pricing for the RG35xxH starts at $68 before shipping from Anbernic's website. That's $4 more than the RG35xx Plus for reference. So I guess you're paying $4 for analog sticks or something like that. After I turned the device on for the first time, the nostalgia was immediately kicked out of me because we've got the same stock OS as the RG35xx Plus. I knew it would be the same considering it's the same hardware, but I half expected ArcOS or Emulex splash screen to appear. I've ranted a bit about the software of the RG35xx Plus in my last video if you want some more details, but basically, most of the same things apply here. It's a half-baked experience riddled with odd UX decisions and this really weird concept of separating standalone emulators from the RetroArch cores. The firmware version here does seem to address some of the issues that I've had on the RG35xx Plus though. For example, the Super Nintendo aspect ratio is correct in RetroArch by default, and there's no bezels enabled either. The firmware on the RG35xx Plus didn't support Wi-Fi passwords over 16 characters without a difficult-to-apply update. Out of the box, that's been fixed on the H by default. I even noticed that there are some upgrades when it comes to the firmware. For example, the RG35xxH has extremely rudimentary theme support. There's also an option in the settings to turn off the power indicator while the device is in sleep mode. When it comes to the standalone emulators compared to the RetroArch cores, I find that the systems that are supported in both actually emulate perfectly fine in either. The benefit of the standalone emulators is that they're easy to configure and you don't really have to think a whole lot about what you want to do in there. RetroArch, while the settings are a bit more convoluted, you can find guides online to do exactly what you want, and there is a ton that you can do. For example, you can do things like change the color palette of Game Boy games from black and white to that pea soup green. So for the meantime, we're stuck with stock OS. Even though the stock OS is a little bit less than stellar, we do have custom firmware on the horizon. Garlic OS actually released an update a few weeks ago that adds in support for the 35xxH. Even though it's in early development and it's missing some key features at this time, it's great to see that there's going to be custom firmware support, and there's probably going to be other firmware on the way as well. As far as the included microSD card, we get thousands upon thousands of games. I don't have an exact number, but there's going to be something for everyone, as long as you're not looking to play any Mario games. But you will find a bunch of classic games, staples such as Star Fox for Super Nintendo, all of the Pokemon games for Game Boy Advance, Crazy Taxi 1 and Crazy Taxi 2 for Dreamcast, Crash Bandicoot, Castlevania, and Resident Evil for PlayStation 1, and even for Pico 8 we've got the Celeste demake, which is pretty fun. Since there's so much to comb through on these microSD cards, I'll usually just go through each system and favorite the games that I know that I already want to play, or sometimes games I've never heard of or maybe want to check out. I usually say to just wipe the microSD card and load up your own games, but there are some hidden gems on these microSD cards every once in a while. I also wanted to point out that while the 35xxH does have support for N64, it won't appear in the RetroArch selection by default because there are no ROMs included on the microSD card. Once you add those ROMs yourself, it will show up. While the capabilities and performance of the 35xxH will be the exact same as the 35xx Plus, I was a lot more willing to tweak some settings and try a bit harder to get games running on the H because of those dual analog sticks. The classic, easier to run systems like Nintendo, Genesis, Game Boy, and Game Boy Color run great through the standalone emulators and the RetroArch cores. Game Boy Advance is a pretty great experience on the device as well, although I was finding it a little bit hard to reach over for the L and R buttons because of how tiny the device is. PlayStation 1 is a good experience on the H, even if the layout is a little bit cramped, it's still quite a bit of fun. I just immediately find the H more playable and more comfortable because of those analog sticks. For the 35xx Plus, I was actually really impressed and surprised by Dreamcast performance, and my expectations were even further exceeded on the H. It's not because the performance itself was any better, it's just the fact that we had the analog stick support. I'm just a sucker for some Crazy Taxi and that awesome soundtrack. Nintendo 64 was a system that I said was flat out not playable on the 35xx Plus. This was somewhat for performance reasons, but mostly because the Plus just simply doesn't have enough controls for N64 games. With the 35xxH, I was more willing to play around with the settings in RetroArch for Nintendo 64 since we actually have enough buttons for the C-Stick, D-pad, and analog stick. By default, the performance is pretty bad, but you can actually change the core from the settings right before you launch the game, and you'll get much better performance overall. Even after you change the core, you might still find that some games are completely unplayable, either because of graphical glitches or just very low frame rates, but still, you can get a lot of games up and running this way. I don't know what would cause this, but I actually was finding that PSP performance is maybe a little bit better on the H compared to the Plus. But still, don't expect to play Ridge Racer or GTA without some massive slowdown and hiccups. Lastly, we can give Nintendo DS a shot here. In the stock firmware, we have support for the stylus now, using the left analog stick to move the pen and then clicking in with R3. So immediately, there's a bunch of games that are playable. Not everything on DS is going to play, but you're going to be able to get a pretty good amount of games running. Compared to the 35xx Plus, even though the H stems from the same hardware, I do feel like this is more of a different class of device altogether. The addition of the analog sticks alone really set this device apart as something different from the Plus. When it comes to comparing the two devices, I think you just have to ask yourself the question of what kind of games do you want to play? Do you prefer horizontal or vertical layouts for your devices instead? I think either way, both have their upsides and downsides. For me though, the out-of-the-box experience for the H is much more refined. I have the option to use the analog sticks for games, and it makes Nintendo 64 possible at least for some games, and I'm partial to the horizontal layout personally. Comparing the 35xxH to the RG35xx, even though I love the 351's huge community support with lots of custom firmware options, and I'm a sucker for metal shell devices, the 35xxH feels like the next generation of the 351 really. The H has a slightly more powerful chipset for DS, some PSP, and even Nintendo 64, all of which were just not an option on the 351, at least without massive downgrades. I think the 35xxH is actually worth considering over the 35xx Plus, and I can't wait to see how custom firmware could possibly improve the H even more. But with more emulation handhelds releasing all of the time and tons more on the horizon, I'm curious, what do you think? Do you think the 35xxH is worth picking up? Does it remind you of the 351M? Is it different enough from the 35xx Plus? Maybe you still use an older emulation handheld. If so, which one? What's your ideal dream emulation handheld? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future videos, and thanks for watching. I'm gonna go back to Pokemon.